Ambassador Zelthara stood at the observation window of the Galactic Concord station and watched the stars in silence, her thin, translucent body glowing with a soft blue light that shifted every time she breathed. And she breathed slowly now because today was important, more important than any day in the last 200 years of her career. The Concord station was enormous, a crystal structure the size of a small moon that floated in orbit around a neutral star where no species held territory, and it had served as the center of galactic diplomacy for 6,000 years, housing representatives from 142 known species who had all agreed long ago that talking was better than fighting, even if the talking sometimes went on for centuries without anyone actually solving anything. Today, a new species was coming, a species that had only been traveling the stars for 87 years, a species that had been granted provisional membership in the Concord just 6 months ago after a brief and somewhat confusing first contact event near the Orion Spur, and that species was called humans. Zelthara turned away from the window and walked down the corridor toward the briefing chamber, where the other senior delegates were already waiting, her long fingers trailing along the wall as she moved with the careful grace that her people the Villani were known for, and she could already feel the tension in the air before she even entered the room. The chamber was full, and the mood was not good. Ambassador Kavrine of the Kachik Collective sat on a raised platform near the ceiling, because his species preferred high places, his 4 wings folded tight against his armored body, and his compound eyes blinking in rapid patterns that meant he was anxious. And beside him floated Delegate Uamu of the Morvala Drift, a shimmering mass of translucent gel roughly the size of a large table who communicated through color changes and vibrations that rippled across their surface. In the far corner stood Trade Minister Hargan of the Dren, a massive herbivore who stood nearly 4 meters tall with 6 legs and a broad flat face covered in gentle eyes. And despite his size, Hargan was known as the most soft-spoken diplomat in the entire Concord, a being who once spent 3 hours apologizing for accidentally stepping on a decorative flower. These were the senior delegates, the ones who would sit across the table from the humans at tomorrow's peace summit, and right now every single one of them was nervous. "I have reviewed the intelligence file on the human species," Kavrine said, his mandibles clicking in a pattern that the translation systems rendered as careful and precise speech. "And I must ask Ambassador Zelthara whether the file contains errors, because what I have read cannot possibly be accurate." Zelthara settled into her seat and let her glow shift to a calm, steady white, the color her people used when they wanted others to feel safe. And she said, "The file is accurate, Ambassador. I have confirmed it through 3 independent sources." "Then these humans," Kavrine continued, "they truly live on a world with active tectonic plates that cause the ground itself to shake and split open." "Yes. And this world has storms that produce electrical discharges from the sky." "Yes, they call it lightning." "And the atmosphere contains a highly reactive gas that causes combustion." "Oxygen, yes, they breathe it. They actually need it to survive." Kavrine's wings buzzed once in what the translator identified as disbelief, and Uamu the Morvala shifted from calm blue to alarmed orange, and even Hargan, the enormous gentle Dren, took a slow step backward which made the floor vibrate. "Perhaps," Hargan said in his deep, slow voice, "perhaps we should discuss whether this summit is wise." Zelthara raised one hand, and her glow pulsed once in a way that meant she was asking for patience, and she said, "I understand your concern, but the humans have shown every sign of being cooperative and friendly. Their communications have been warm and enthusiastic. They have expressed genuine excitement about joining the Concord and participating in diplomatic exchange. I believe we have nothing to fear." She believed this mostly, although she had read the part of the file that described human evolutionary history, and had needed to sit quietly in a dark room for 20 minutes afterward, because learning that a species had evolved as persistent predators who chased their prey across open plains until the prey collapsed from exhaustion was not the kind of thing that helped a person sleep well. But she kept that to herself. Far away, on the other side of the sector, the human diplomatic cruiser ISS Olive Branch was making its final preparations for arrival. And on the bridge of that ship, Captain Elena Vasquez sat in her command chair and smiled at her crew with the kind of warm confidence that made people trust her. Elena was 43 years old with dark hair pulled back in a neat braid and brown eyes that could shift from friendly to fierce in less than a second. Though today they were firmly set on friendly, because today was the day humanity made its first real appearance on the galactic stage, and she was not going to let anything go wrong. "All right, everyone," she said, standing up and looking around at the 12 members of her diplomatic team. "This is it. This is the moment we have been preparing for. We are about to walk into a room full of alien species who do not know us and who are trusting us to be good guests and good partners. So let me be very clear about what I expect from every single one of you." She paused and then said, "Be yourselves." Lieutenant Commander James Park, her chief of security, raised an eyebrow and said, "That is the whole briefing." "That is the whole briefing," Elena confirmed. "We are not going to pretend to be something we are not. We are going to be warm and honest and respectful. We are going to shake hands and make eye contact and show these beings that humanity is worth knowing. Any questions?" Engineer Marco Reyes, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and grease permanently embedded under his fingernails no matter how hard he scrubbed, raised his hand and said, "Captain, I packed coffee as a gift. Is that still a good idea?" "Excellent idea, Marco. Everyone loves coffee." "I also packed chocolate." "Even better." "And Dr. Singh grew a bonsai tree in the botany lab that she wants to present to the Velani ambassador." Elena clapped her hands together once and said, "Perfect. That is thoughtful and beautiful and exactly the kind of gesture that will show them who we are." Nobody on the Olive Branch knew that coffee was a psychoactive stimulant that most galactic species would consider a dangerous drug, or that chocolate contained compounds lethal to at least 3 species expected at the summit, or that the Velani had a deep spiritual connection to plant life and would view the bonsai tree not as art, but as evidence that humans imprisoned and twisted living beings for their own pleasure. Nobody knew any of that yet. The Olive Branch dropped out of faster-than-light travel at exactly the scheduled time, emerging into normal space within visual range of the conquered station. And on the station, every sensor array and early warning system activated simultaneously, because what appeared on their screens was not what they had expected. The human vessel was not small, it was not modest, and it was not unarmed. The Olive Branch was a Resolute-class diplomatic cruiser, which to the humans meant it was a comfortable, well-equipped ship, suitable for long-range missions with enough defensive capability to handle any trouble along the way. But to the galactic species watching from the station, it looked like something else entirely, because the ship carried more weapons than most species used to defend their entire home systems. 48 torpedo tubes, 12-point defense batteries, reinforced ablative armor plating, and an engine array so powerful it made the station's energy readings spike into warning territory. And all of this was what the humans considered standard equipment for a ship whose primary mission was delivering diplomats. On the observation deck, Zelthara stared at the approaching vessel and felt her glow flicker in a way she could not control, shifting from calm white to something closer to violet, which was the color her people only showed when they experienced deep primal fear. Behind her caverines, wings were buzzing so fast they had become a blur. Uamu had turned a shade of red that no one in the room had ever seen a Morvala turn before. And Hargan, the 4-meter-tall Dren, who weighed as much as a ground transport vehicle, had moved behind a support column. They said this was a peace delegation. Zelthara whispered. The communication system chimed, and a warm, cheerful human voice filled the observation deck. "Conquered Station, this is Captain Elena Vasquez of the ISS Olive Branch, requesting permission to dock. We are so excited to be here, and we brought gifts. Looking forward to meeting everyone." The voice was bright and happy and sincere, and that somehow made it worse. Zelthara closed her eyes and took a long breath and reminded herself that she was a professional with 200 years of diplomatic experience. Then she opened her eyes and walked toward the docking bay to greet humanity. Her glow did not return to white for the entire walk. The docking bay was enormous and cold, and filled with the kind of silence that only happens when a large number of beings are all holding their breath at the same time. And Zelthara stood at the front of the welcoming party with her hands clasped together, and her glow forced into the steadiest white she could manage, while behind her 24 delegates from various species arranged themselves in what they hoped looked like a confident and dignified formation. It did not look confident or dignified. It looked like a group of very nervous people standing too close together for comfort, but Zelthara decided not to mention that. The airlock seal hissed, and then began to open with a slow mechanical groan that echoed through the bay, and every alien eye and sensor and antenna in the room turned toward it, and Zelthara felt the temperature of her own skin drop by 2 degrees, which was something that happened to Villani when their bodies were preparing for danger. The first human stepped through the airlock, and the room changed. His name was Lieutenant Commander James Park, and he was the chief of security, and he was not particularly large by human standards, but by galactic standards, he was a thing that should not exist. A dense, heavy gravity-adapted predator who moved with a kind of smooth, easy coordination that told every prey species instinct in the room that this being knew exactly how to use his body, and could close the distance between himself and anything he wanted to reach in less time than it would take most of them to turn around. He stepped onto the station floor, and his boot hit the metal with a deep solid thud that Uamu the Morvale felt through their entire gelatinous body like a shockwave, and then more humans came through behind him, one after another, 12 in total, each one moving with that same fluid predatory grace, each one heavy and solid and radiating heat like small furnaces, because humans ran at a core body temperature that most galactic species associated with severe fever. They were warm-blooded in a way that was almost aggressive. Captain Elena Vasquez came through last, and she was smaller than several of her crew members, but she moved with an authority that made her seem larger, and she stopped at the front of the human group and looked out at the assembled delegates with a face full of genuine happiness. And then she did the thing that nearly caused a diplomatic incident before a single word was spoken. She smiled. Her lips pulled back and her teeth appeared, white and straight and numerous, and to every human in the room it was a warm, welcoming expression of joy and friendliness. But to the galactic delegates, it was something very different because in the vast majority of species across the known galaxy, the baring of teeth meant one thing, and one thing only: thread. Ambassador Caverine's wings exploded into a buzzing frenzy so loud it sounded like a small engine starting up, and 3 junior K-Chick delegates launched themselves toward the ceiling on pure instinct, and Uamu turned a color that was later described in official reports as emergency white, which was a shade the Morvale only produced when they believed death was immediate. A young Dren diplomat named Torval, who had been standing near the back of the welcoming party, saw the teeth, and felt every one of his 6 legs go weak at the same time, and the world tilted, and his massive body began to fall sideways toward the floor with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a very large being who had completely lost consciousness. Elena saw the huge alien start to topple, and she moved without thinking. She crossed 3 meters in less than a second and caught Torval, all 300 kilograms of him, with one arm braced under his midsection and the other steadying his broad neck, and she lowered him gently to the floor with a careful controlled motion that used muscles most galactic species did not believe biological organisms could possess. The room went completely silent. Not the nervous silence from before, but a different kind of silence. The kind of silence that happens when a large number of beings all realize at the same moment that their understanding of the universe needs to be significantly revised. Elena knelt beside the unconscious Dren and looked up at the delegates with concern on her face and said, "Is he okay? Does he need medical attention? I think he fainted. It is probably the excitement." She was still smiling. Zelthara stared at the human woman who had just caught a falling dren with her bare hands the way someone might catch a dropped cup, and she thought very carefully about what to say. And what she said was, "He will be fine, Captain Vasquez. The dren occasionally experience vasovagal responses to new stimuli. Thank you for your quick reaction." What she wanted to say was something very different, but she was a professional. Alina stood up and brushed off her uniform, and then extended her hand toward Zelthara in what the humans called a handshake. And Zelthara had been briefed on this custom, so she reached out and took the human's hand, and immediately understood something that no briefing document could have prepared her for. The human was so warm. Alina's hand was like holding a stone that had been sitting in direct sunlight, and her grip was firm but clearly restrained. And Zelthara could feel the raw physical power contained in those 5 fingers, the way you could feel the hum of an engine through a wall. And she realized with a deep, quiet certainty that this small human woman could crush every bone in her hand without any effort at all, and that she was choosing not to. "It is so wonderful to meet you, Ambassador," Alina said, and her voice was warm and genuine and her eyes were bright with real emotion. "We have been looking forward to this for months. My whole crew has. We brought gifts." She turned and gestured to her team, and Engineer Marco Reyes stepped forward carrying a sealed container with a proud grin on his face. "We brought coffee," he said. "It is our favorite drink. We thought you might enjoy it." Nobody told him that coffee contained caffeine, which was classified as a Class 3 psychoactive compound by the Galactic Health Authority, and was restricted or outright banned in 47 star systems. Dr. Priya Singh stepped forward next carrying a beautiful wooden box and said, "We brought chocolate. It is one of our greatest culinary achievements. We make it from the seed of a tree that grows near the equator of our planet." Nobody told her that theobromine, the compound that gave chocolate its distinctive character, was acutely toxic to the dren the Morvala, and the small quiet species called the Feln who had already quietly left the docking bay. Then Dr. Singh presented the final gift, a small ceramic pot containing a perfectly shaped bonsai tree, its tiny branches twisted into an elegant form that had taken her 3 years of patient daily care to achieve, and she offered it to Zelthara with both hands and a gentle bow and said, "This is for you, Ambassador. On Earth, we consider the shaping of living trees to be one of our highest art forms." Zelthara took the pot and looked at the tiny tree, and felt something complicated happen inside her chest. The Velani could sense plant life. They could feel the slow, quiet pulse of biological energy that flowed through roots and stems and leaves. And what Zelthara felt from this small tree was not pain exactly, but something that might be called resignation. The deep, patient endurance of a living thing that had been bent and cut and shaped by powerful hands for years, and had learned to grow within the boundaries it had been given. The humans had taken a tree and made it small and called it beautiful. Zelthara placed the pot carefully on a nearby surface and said, "Thank you, Dr. Singh. It is a remarkable gift." And her voice did not shake at all, which she considered one of the greatest diplomatic achievements of her career. As she led the human delegation down the corridor toward their quarters, the security officer James Park fell into step beside her and made casual conversation the way humans apparently did, with everyone regardless of rank or species, or the fact that they had met approximately 4 minutes ago. "Nice station you have here," he said, looking around with genuine appreciation. "Very clean, great lighting. We had a smooth trip over too. Had to take a little detour around the Kessler Nebula because of some pirate activity, but other than that, no problems." Zelthara glanced at him and said, "Pirate activity? Was there a confrontation?" Park shrugged, a gesture that involved raising and dropping his shoulders in a way that communicated complete indifference, and he said, "Nothing major, just a small raider flotilla, maybe 8 or 9 ships. We handled it." "You handled it?" "Yeah, they fired on us first, so we returned fire, and that was pretty much it. Took about 6 minutes. Anyway, like I said, great station. Is the gravity adjustable in our quarters? Because some of my team prefer it a little heavier." Zelthara walked in silence for several steps, processing the fact that the humans had destroyed an entire pirate flotilla on their way to a peace summit, and considered it so unremarkable that their security chief mentioned it with the same level of interest as the quality of the hallway lighting. That evening she sat alone in her quarters and composed her first official report to the Concord Council, and she wrote many things about protocol and procedure and diplomatic expectations. But the line that would later be quoted in every major publication across the galaxy was the last one. "The humans are polite," she wrote, "and I am beginning to believe this may be the most dangerous thing about them." She read it twice, and then sent it, and then sat in the dark for a long time with the bonsai tree glowing faintly on the table beside her. The Grand Deliberation Chamber was the heart of the Concord station, a vast circular hall with a ceiling so high it disappeared into soft artificial clouds, and every surface was designed to make the beings inside feel small and humble, because the founders of the Concord believed that diplomacy worked best when everyone remembered they were not the most important thing in the universe. 112 delegates from 46 species took their seats that morning, arranged in concentric rings that rose gently from the central speaking floor, and the chamber hummed with the quiet sounds of a dozen different languages being whispered and clicked and vibrated as everyone settled in for what they expected would be a long and careful and extremely indirect day of negotiation. The primary issue on the agenda was the border dispute between the K-Chick Collective and the Morvalet Drift, a conflict that had been simmering for 200 years over a stretch of resource-rich space near the Valen Corridor. And it had been discussed at no fewer than 37 previous summits without resolution, because both sides considered direct confrontation to be deeply uncivilized and preferred instead to express their disagreements through layers of metaphor and implication, so thick that it sometimes took a full day of debate for anyone to figure out what was actually being said. This was how galactic diplomacy worked, and it had worked this way for 6,000 years, and nobody saw any reason to change it. The humans sat in the section reserved for provisional species near the top of the chamber, and Captain Elena Vasquez looked down at the speaking floor with the expression of someone who was trying very hard to follow a conversation in a language she did not fully understand. The morning session began with Ambassador Kaverine of the K-Chick taking the floor and delivering a 45-minute address about the historical significance of stellar cartography in K-Chick culture, which was his way of saying that his people had mapped the Valen Corridor first and therefore had a stronger claim to it. But he never actually said that because saying it directly would have been considered rude. Then Delegate Uamu of the Morvalet rippled onto the speaking floor and spent an hour describing the migratory patterns of deep space organisms that traveled through the Valen Corridor, which was their way of arguing that the corridor was a natural passage that could not be owned by anyone. But again, they did not say this directly because that was not how things were done. Then a Velani trade mediator spoke for 30 minutes about the philosophical nature of boundaries, and a Dren economic advisor gave a presentation about shared resource models that managed to go on for nearly an hour, without once mentioning the specific resources that were actually being disputed. Elena sat through all of this with her hands folded in her lap and her brow slightly furrowed, and after 3 hours and 17 minutes, she leaned over to Lieutenant Commander Park and whispered, "James, am I missing something? Or have they been arguing about the same thing for 3 hours without anyone actually saying what they want?" Park, who had been reviewing the historical files on his data pad, whispered back, "Captain, I have been reading the records, and they have been arguing about this same thing in this same way for 200 years. Elena stared at him. 200 years. 200 years. Elena sat very still for a moment and something shifted in her expression, and then she raised her hand. The chamber went quiet because raising one's hand to request the speaking floor was not unusual, but a provisional species doing it during a senior-level border negotiation was unprecedented, and every translator in the room flickered as beings tried to figure out whether this was a breach of protocol or simply a sign that the humans did not know the rules. Zelthara, who was serving as session moderator, looked up at Alina and felt her glow shift to a cautious amber. And she said, "The chair recognizes Captain Vasquez of the human delegation." Alina stood up and walked down the steps to the central speaking floor, and her boots made that heavy thudding sound with each step that the delegates had already begun to associate with the feeling of mild existential dread. And she stood in the center of the chamber and looked around at the assembled representatives of dozens of civilizations, and she spoke. "Thank you, Ambassador Zelthara, and thank you to all the delegates for allowing me to speak. I have been listening carefully to everything that has been said this morning, and I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly." She paused and then said, "The Kachik Collective wants access to the mineral resources in the Valen Corridor, because those resources are essential to their industrial infrastructure, and they map the corridor first. And the Morvalea Drift wants the corridor to remain open because their people have used it as a migration route for thousands of years, and restricting access would cause real harm to their way of life. Is that right?" The silence that followed was so complete that Zelthara could hear her own bioluminescence humming. Nobody had ever stated the actual positions of both sides out loud in the deliberation chamber before, not once in 200 years of negotiation. And the effect was something like watching someone walk into a room full of people who had been pretending they could not see the enormous animal sitting in the middle of the floor and pointing at it and saying, "So about that animal." Kavrin's mandibles opened and closed several times without producing any sound. Uamu turned 3 different colors in rapid succession. Alina continued because she did not realize she had just done something extraordinary. "It seems to me that both of these needs are legitimate, and that they do not actually conflict with each other. The Kachik need the minerals and the Morvalea need the passage. So what if the Kachik were granted extraction rights to the mineral deposits along the edges of the corridor, while the central lane remained open and unobstructed for Morvalea migration, with a demilitarized buffer zone maintained by a joint commission to make sure neither side interferes with the other?" She looked at Kavrin and said, "Ambassador, does that address your needs?" Kavrin stared at her for a long moment and then said, "It does." She looked at Uamu and said, "Delegate, does that work for you?" Uamu shifted to a thoughtful green and then to a cautious but hopeful gold and said through their translator, "It is acceptable." Alina smiled and said, "Great, should we write it up?" Zelthara sat in her moderator's chair and watched a 200-year-old conflict get resolved in 11 minutes by a being whose species had been in space for less than a century, and she felt something she had never felt before in her diplomatic career, which was the sensation of being completely and totally outmaneuvered by someone who was not even trying to outmaneuver anyone. During the midday recess, the humans mingled with the other delegates in the reception hall. And this was where things became complicated in a different way, because humans, it turned out, were a profoundly physical species in their social interactions. Alina shook hands with everyone she met, wrapping her warm, dense fingers around appendages that had never been gripped before, and she made direct eye contact with a steady, unblinking focus that several species found deeply unsettling, because among many galactic cultures, sustained eye contact was either a dominance challenge or a prelude to attack. Marco Reyes patted a Kachik trade representative on the back in a gesture of friendliness that sent the insectoid stumbling forward 2 steps, and when Marco apologized and asked if they were okay, the Kachik said yes in a voice that was not entirely steady. Dr. Singh placed a guiding hand on the shoulder of a Dren delegate who seemed lost on the way to the refreshment area, and the Dren froze in place and stood motionless for a full 30 seconds after she walked away, as if his body needed time to process the fact that a predator had just touched him and nothing bad had happened. But the moment that would be talked about for years came when a junior Morvalea delegate named Shimmer, who had been part of the border dispute negotiation team, began to change colors in a pattern that indicated deep sadness. And when Alina asked what was wrong, Shimmer explained that they were thinking about all the years their people and the K-Chick had spent in conflict when the solution had been so simple. Alina looked at Shimmer with genuine empathy, and then she did something that no being in galactic history had ever done to a Morvaler. She hugged them. She wrapped her arms around the shimmering gelatinous mass of Shimmer's body and held on gently, and Shimmer went absolutely rigid with shock, every cell in their body freezing in place, and they turned a color that nobody in the room could identify, because it was not a color that Morvaler were known to produce. Alina held on for about 5 seconds and then let go and said, "It is going to be okay. The hard part is over." Shimmer did not move or change color for nearly a full minute, and when they finally did speak, all they said was, "What was that?" "A hug," Alina said. "It means I care about you." On the other side of the station, something else was happening that would add yet another layer to the growing mythology around the human species, because a crew member from the Olive Branch, named Specialist Tomoko Hayashi, had wandered into the station's arboretum during her free time, and had done something that humans considered perfectly normal, and that the Vellani considered something close to a miracle. She was talking to the plants. Tomoko was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the arboretum surrounded by tall alien ferns and flowering vines, and she was speaking to them in a quiet, gentle voice, the way she spoke to the plants in her quarters back on the ship, telling them they were beautiful and asking them if they were getting enough light. And she had no idea that 3 Vellani botanists were watching from behind a partition, with expressions of absolute shock on their glowing faces. Because the plants were responding. The Vellani could sense plant biosignals the way other species could sense sound or light, and what they were sensing was impossible. The plants in the arboretum were reaching toward the human, their growth patterns subtly shifting, their chemical signals changing to something the Vellani had never encountered before, something that could only be described as comfort. Humans exhaled carbon dioxide, which plants needed to survive, and they radiated heat and low-frequency, sound vibrations that stimulated cellular growth. And this human woman was sitting among the plants and breathing on them and talking to them, and the plants were flourishing in her presence like they had found a small son. One of the Vellani botanists turned to the others and whispered a word that had not been spoken aloud in 3,000 years, a word from their oldest religious texts that referred to a mythological being who could walk among growing things and make them thrive simply by existing near them. "World Shaper," she whispered. By the end of the first day of the summit, the border dispute was resolved, and the humans had accidentally performed what the Vellani considered a religious miracle, and every delegate on the station was struggling to process the same impossible realization. The humans were not pretending to be kind. They were not performing friendliness as a strategy. They were not using warmth as a weapon. They actually meant it. And nobody knew what to do with that. The evening cycle on the Concord station was a gentle thing, a slow dimming of the lights that mimicked the sunset of a world that no longer existed. And as the corridors softened into warm amber tones, the delegates gathered on the communal recreation deck for a social event that had been planned weeks in advance as a gesture of welcome for the new species. It was supposed to be calm, and it was supposed to be controlled, and it was supposed to be the kind of quiet, civilized gathering where beings from different worlds could stand near each other and exchange carefully measured pleasantries while consuming mild nutrient preparations. The humans had other ideas. They arrived carrying instruments. Marco Reyes had his guitar slung over his shoulder, a battered acoustic thing with scratches on the body, and a small sticker on the back that said, "This machine kills silence." And Specialist Tomoko Hayashi carried a wooden flute she had carved herself during a long voyage 2 years ago, and Lieutenant Park had somehow produced a small hand drum from somewhere, and Dr. Singh was humming under her breath in a way that made the nearest Morvalet delegate ripple involuntarily. Zelthara watched them set up in a corner of the recreation deck and felt a new kind of unease settle into her body, not the sharp fear of the docking bay or the stunned confusion of the deliberation chamber, but something lower and deeper, a premonition that something was about to happen that she did not have a framework for. Captain Vasquez, she said, approaching Alina, who was helping Marco tune his guitar. What are your crew preparing? Alina looked up with that devastating smile that Zelthara was slowly learning to interpret as genuine happiness, rather than a threat display, and said, Music, Ambassador. We thought it would be nice to play some songs for everyone. It is something humans do when we want to bring people together. Music, Zelthara repeated. Yes, organized sound, rhythm and melody. It is one of our oldest art forms. We have been making music for longer than we have been writing. Zelthara nodded and stepped back and thought about the phrase organized sound and decided that it sounded harmless enough. It was not harmless. Marco played the first chord on his guitar, and the sound moved through the recreation deck like something alive. A warm, rich vibration that carried frequencies the galactic species had never heard arranged in that particular way, because human music was not like anything else in the known universe. Most galactic species communicated in precise controlled tones, single frequencies modulated with mathematical accuracy, and their concept of organized sound was similarly precise. Clean, simple patterns designed to convey specific information without ambiguity. But human music was the opposite of that. It was layered and complex and emotional and messy, multiple frequencies overlapping and harmonizing and clashing in ways that should have been chaos, but somehow were not. Marco began to sing. His voice was a deep, warm baritone that filled the space without effort, and the song was an old earth folk song about a traveler who was far from home and missed the people he loved. And he sang it simply and honestly with his eyes half closed and his fingers moving across the strings with the unconscious ease of someone who had been playing since he was a child. The effect on the delegates was immediate and devastating. The Kachik delegates, who perceived sound through vibration sensors along their entire bodies, felt the music move through them like a wave, and their wings began to vibrate in sympathy with the harmonics. And one by one, they entered a state that their species called deep resonance, a kind of meditative trance that usually only occurred during their most sacred rituals, and they stood motionless with their wings humming softly in patterns that matched the melody. Uamu, the Morvala, began to change colors in ways that had no name, shifting through shades that their species had never produced before, and the changes were not random. They were following the emotional arc of the music, moving from warm gold during the gentle verses to deep blue during the longing chorus, and other Morvala in the room began to do the same until they looked like a collection of slowly pulsing lights, responding to a signal they could not resist. And then something happened that no Morvala had done in recorded history. Uamu began to cry. The Morvala did not have tear ducts or eyes in the way most species understood them, but they had a stress response that caused them to shed small droplets of their outer membrane when overwhelmed, and it had always been associated with physical damage or extreme fear. But Uamu was not afraid and was not hurt. Uamu was feeling something that their species had no word for, something the humans would have simply called being moved. Zelthara stood near the wall and felt her bioluminescence shifting beyond her control, her glow cycling through colors she had never produced consciously, responding to the music the way a leaf responds to wind. And she realized with a strange, distant clarity that what the humans were doing was not just creating organized sound. They were projecting emotion directly into the nervous systems of every being in the room. The music was by any technical definition a low-grade psionic weapon, and the humans had no idea. They thought they were just playing a nice song. Tomoko joined in with her flute, and the sound became richer and more complex, and Park added a gentle rhythm on his drum, and Dr. Singh began to harmonize with Marco in a high, clear voice that made 3 Vellani delegates grab onto each other for support. And the recreation deck became a place that no one in the room had ever been before, a place where 100 different species were all feeling the same thing at the same time. Captain Vasquez watched her crew play, and her eyes were bright with tears, because the song always made her think of her daughter back on Earth, and she did not try to hide it because humans did not consider it weakness to cry when something was beautiful. Then the alarms went off. The sound cut through the music like a blade, sharp and urgent and red, and every being in the room froze as the station's emergency systems activated with a priority alert that flashed across every display surface in the room. Hull breach in Maintenance Corridor 7. Atmosphere venting. 3 Villani technicians trapped in the affected section. Standard protocol was clear and well established, and every delegate knew it. The section would be sealed and repair drones would be dispatched, and the process would take approximately 40 minutes, during which the trapped technicians would survive on emergency oxygen reserves that were designed to last exactly that long. It was efficient and it was safe, and it was how things were done. The humans did not follow protocol. Before Zelthara could even process the information on the emergency display, she heard the sound of heavy boots hitting the floor at full sprint, and she turned to see 4 humans already running, not away from the danger but toward it, moving through the corridor at a speed that made the other delegates press themselves against the walls. Marco Reyes was in the lead, and he was running faster than any being on the station had ever seen a biological organism move outside of a predator chase, his legs driving him forward with the powerful ground-eating stride that his species had evolved for exactly this kind of moment, the moment when something needed to be reached and reached now. He reached Maintenance Corridor 7 in under 2 minutes, and he could hear the atmosphere screaming through the breach, a high-pitched shriek of air being pulled into vacuum, and he could see through the emergency window that 3 Villani were huddled together on the far side of the corridor, their glow flickering with terror as the air thinned around them. The emergency seal had malfunctioned, the repair drones were still 4 minutes away, and the breach was growing. Marco did not hesitate. He did not calculate. He did not weigh the risks. He pulled a pressure patch from the emergency kit on the wall, and he opened the corridor door and stepped inside. The decompression hit him immediately, the air rushing past him with a force that would have knocked most galactic species off their feet, and the pressure drop made his ears ring and his vision blur, and he could feel the capillaries in his eyes beginning to burst as the blood vessels in his face expanded against the dropping pressure. He reached the breach in the hull, a jagged tear about the width of his shoulders, and he slammed the pressure patch against it and held it in place with both hands and pushed. The force trying to pull the patch away from the hull was enormous, the entire atmosphere of the corridor pressing against his hands, trying to escape into the void of space, and Marco set his feet and locked his arms and held on. His skin bruised, his muscles screamed, his lungs burned as the thinning air made every breath a battle, and the emergency systems registered the patch and began to engage the permanent seal, but the process was not fast. It was not designed for a manual hold, and Marco stood there with his hands against the hull and his body fighting vacuum for 97 seconds. 97 seconds of a human being deciding that physics and biology and the very reasonable instinct for self-preservation were all less important than the fact that there were 3 frightened people behind him who needed help. The seal engaged and the breach closed, and the atmosphere stabilizers kicked in, and Marco let go of the patch, and his hands were shaking, and his eyes were red with burst blood vessels, and his arms were covered in deep purple bruises, and he turned around and looked at the 3 Villani technicians who were staring at him with their glow completely extinguished by shock. "Is everyone okay?" he said, and his voice was hoarse but steady. They could not answer because they had just watched a creature from a death world hold back the vacuum of space with its bare hands to save beings it had never met. Later in the station's medical bay, a 4-armed Thesic doctor named Varun examined Marco and documented injuries that should have been debilitating and would have been fatal to most species, and then watched with visible confusion as the human's body began to repair itself at a rate that the Galactic medical database had no framework for. The bruises were already fatting, the burst capillaries were already healing, the muscle damage was already being addressed by a biological repair system so aggressive and efficient that Varun had to recalibrate their instruments twice to make sure the readings were accurate. "Why did you do it?" Varun asked as they worked, their 4 hands moving with practiced precision across Marco's arms. Marco looked at the doctor as if the question made no sense and said, "There were people in there. You could have died. But they definitely would have died. That is not a rational calculation." Marco thought about it for a moment and then shrugged and said, "Maybe not, but it is the right one." Varun stood still for a long time after Marco left, and then they opened the medical file on the human species and added a note at the bottom that would later be shared across every medical institution in the galaxy. "Addendum to the file on species designation human," they wrote. "They do not appear to understand that they are supposed to die." The video of Marco holding the hull patch spread across the station's internal network within an hour, and by morning every species on the conquered station had seen it. The human with the red eyes and the shaking hands standing between 3 strangers and the void and refusing to let go. The fear that the delegates had carried since the humans arrived did not go away. It was still there in the way they stepped aside when a human walked past, and in the way their translators occasionally glitched when trying to process human vocal patterns. But something else had begun to grow alongside it. Something that felt a lot like hope. The final morning of the summit arrived, and the conquered station felt different. Not in any way that the environmental systems could measure, but in the way that all the beings moving through its corridors carried themselves. Something had shifted in the 3 days since the humans had come aboard, and it was the kind of shift that could not be undone. Zelthara walked to the grand deliberation chamber earlier than she needed to because she wanted a few minutes alone in the vast room before it filled with delegates. And she stood on the speaking floor in the quiet and let her glow settle into the soft contemplative silver that her people used when they were thinking deeply about something that mattered. 3 days, that was all it had been. 3 days since the human ship had appeared on their sensors bristling with weapons and broadcasting cheerful greetings. 3 days since a woman with a predator's smile had caught a falling dren with one hand. 3 days since a species that drank psychoactive stimulants for pleasure and breathed reactive gas had walked into the most sophisticated diplomatic institution in the galaxy and accidentally turned everything upside down. The delegates began to arrive, and Zelthara noticed something immediately. The seating pattern had changed. For 6,000 years, the species of the conquered had arranged themselves in the chamber, according to a careful protocol that placed potential rivals far apart and clustered allies together. But today, the Kachik delegates had moved their platforms closer to the Morvalet section, and the Dren had shifted their seats toward the center, and everywhere Zelthara looked the old careful distances were shrinking. The humans had not asked anyone to do this. They had not suggested it. They had not even noticed it, but it was happening because of them. Captain Vasquez arrived with her team, and they took their seats in the provisional species section near the top of the chamber. And Alina looked tired but happy, and Marco Reyes sat beside her with his arms still faintly bruised, but his eyes clear and his posture relaxed. And Zelthara watched them settle in, and felt something warm and complicated move through her chest. The final session was called to order, and the first matter of business was the formal ratification of the Valen Corridor Agreement, the border dispute that had consumed 200 years of diplomatic effort, and had been resolved in 11 minutes by a human who simply asked both sides what they actually wanted. The agreement was ratified unanimously, and when the vote was announced, Alina pumped her fist in the air in a gesture of celebration that made several nearby delegates flinch, but only slightly. They were learning. Then came the matter that Zelthara had spent the previous night preparing for, the matter that she had discussed with the senior delegates in a private session that had lasted until the small hours of the morning cycle, the matter that she knew would change the shape of the galaxy. She took the speaking floor. "Distinguished delegates," she began, and her glow shifted to the deep, steady gold that Velani used for formal addresses of great importance. For 6,000 years, the Galactic Conquered has maintained peace among the stars through patience and caution and the careful, slow work of understanding. And in that time, we have accomplished much. We have prevented wars and resolved conflicts and built a civilization that spans a galaxy, and we should be proud of what we have built. She paused and then said, "But we should also be honest about what we have failed to do." The chamber was very quiet. The Valen corridor dispute lasted 200 years, 200 years during which the Kachik and the Morvalae suffered real harm while we debated and deliberated and spoke around the problem instead of addressing it. And we accepted this because it was how things had always been done, because directness was considered uncivilized, because we believed that the slow, careful approach was the only way. She looked up at the human delegation, and Alina met her eyes with an expression of warm attention. 3 days ago, a species that has been traveling the stars for less than a century arrived at this station, and in those 3 days they have resolved a conflict we could not solve in 2 centuries. They have demonstrated a capacity for immediate selfless action that our protocols do not account for. They have shown us that warmth and directness and compassion are not signs of primitiveness, but of a kind of strength that we do not have a word for in any of our languages. She took a breath and her glow brightened. I have also seen them do things that I do not fully understand. I have seen a human woman catch a falling dren with her bare hands and ask if he was all right. I have seen a human man hold back the vacuum of space for 97 seconds to save 3 people he had never met, and then ask why anyone thought that was unusual. I have seen them project emotion through organized sound in a way that made a Morvalae cry for the first time in recorded history. And I have seen them sit among plants and make them grow. A murmur moved through the chamber. "They are terrifying," Zalthara said simply. "I will not pretend otherwise. They come from a world that is trying to kill them every single day. They breathe poison and drink stimulants, and their bodies repair themselves, as if death is an inconvenience rather than a destination. And they do all of this while being genuinely and completely kind. And that combination is the most frightening thing I have ever encountered." She let that settle and then said, "Which is exactly why I am recommending that the Conquered grant the human species full membership effective immediately, waiving the standard 50-year provisional period." The chamber erupted. Not in anger, but in the buzzing, clicking, rippling, humming sound of 100 species, all reacting at once, some in shock and some in agreement, and some in the complicated space between the two, and Zalthara stood in the center of it and waited. "The motion is on the floor," she said. "I call for a vote." The vote was conducted in the traditional way, each species registering their position through their delegation's formal mechanism, and it took 12 minutes for all 46 delegations to cast their votes. And when the results were displayed on the chamber's central screen, the number was unanimous. 46 in favor, 0 against. Humanity was now a full member of the Galactic Concord. Alina stood in the provisional section with her hand over her mouth and her eyes shining with tears, and beside her Marco was grinning so wide that 3 nearby delegates instinctively leaned away from the teeth before catching themselves. And Dr. Singh was hugging Tomoko, and Lieutenant Park was standing very straight with his jaw tight in the way that humans did when they were trying not to cry in public. Several delegates later admitted privately that they had voted yes partly because they had concluded it was strategically better to have the humans inside the Concord's framework than outside it, where they might do anything. But most of them also admitted that strategy was not the only reason. The farewell gathering was held in the docking bay where the humans had first arrived, and it was a smaller affair, just the senior delegates and the human crew, and the mood was warm in a way that the station had never felt before. Alina moved through the gathering saying goodbye to each delegate personally, shaking hands with beings who no longer flinched at her grip, making eye contact with species who had learned that her steady gaze was not a challenge but a form of respect, and smiling at everyone because that was who she was, and she had never been willing to be anyone else. When she reached Zalthara, she stopped, and her expression became serious and tender at the same time. "Ambassador," Alina said, "I want to thank you for everything you have done for us these past 3 days. I know we are a lot to deal with, and I know we probably did about 100 things wrong without realizing it, and your patience and grace have meant more to us than I can say." Zalthara's glow shifted to something soft and said, "You did do many things wrong, Captain. You brought us poison as a gift. Your smiles terrified half the delegation. Your security chief mentioned destroying a pirate fleet as casually as commenting on the weather. And one of your crew members may have accidentally fulfilled a Velani religious prophecy. Elena winced slightly and said, I am so sorry. Do not be, Zelthara said, because you also did something right, something that none of us expected. You were exactly who you are. And who you are is something this galaxy needs, even if it does not entirely know what to do with you yet. Elena reached into her bag and pulled out one final gift, a small envelope made of paper which was itself a novelty since most galactic species had stopped using plant-based materials thousands of years ago. And she handed it to Zelthara and said, This is from my daughter. She is 7 years old. Her name is Sophia. When I told her I was going to meet aliens, she made this for you. Zelthara opened the envelope and pulled out a card made of thick colored paper. And on the front was a drawing done in crayon showing a tall stick figure with blue skin holding hands with a smaller stick figure with brown hair. And around them were stars and hearts, and what appeared to be a cat, although it might also have been a spaceship. And inside the card, in large, uneven letters written by a child, who was still learning to control a crayon, were the words, Dear aliens, please be friends with my mom, she is nice. Zelthara held the card and stared at it, and her glow began to change, shifting through colors that the other Velani in the room had never seen before, moving past every known shade in their bioluminescent vocabulary into something entirely new, a color that seemed to contain light from a spectrum they did not know they could access. Later, when asked to describe what she had felt in that moment, Zelthara would say that the color was the one her species reserved for awe. But that was not entirely accurate because awe did not cover it. The word she eventually settled on was one that she had to borrow from the humans themselves, because her own language did not have an equivalent. The word was love. The ISS Olive Branch undocked from the Concord station at exactly the scheduled time, its engines powering up with a deep thrumming vibration that the delegates could feel through the observation deck floor, and its weapon arrays gleaming in the starlight in a way that still made everyone slightly uncomfortable, and its crew waving through the viewport with enthusiastic grins that still showed far too many teeth. The delegates stood on the observation deck and watched the ship pull away, and Zelthara stood at the front with the crayon card held carefully in her thin, glowing hands. Beside her, a young K-Chick diplomat named Tikver, who had been assigned to the summit as a junior observer, and who had spent the last 3 days in a state of continuous low-grade panic, turned to her and said, Ambassador, may I ask you something? Of course. The humans, Tikver said, and his wings buzzed once with residual nervousness. Are they going to conquer us? Zelthara watched the olive branch align itself with the jump corridor, its massive engines building power, its hull catching the light of distant stars, carrying 12 impossible beings back to their impossible world where the ground shook and the sky burned and everything was trying to kill them, and they thrived anyway. Not because they were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but because they cared about things so deeply and so recklessly that the universe itself seemed to bend around their refusal to give up on anyone or anything. The ship jumped to faster than light speed and disappeared in a streak of brilliant white light that cut across the darkness like a promise. No, Zelthara said softly, and her glow settled into that new impossible color that had no name in any language except the one she had borrowed from the very species she was watching disappear into the stars. I think they are going to save us. She held the card a little tighter. And that terrifies me even more. The light from the human ship faded and the stars returned to their ancient patient silence, and the galaxy continued to turn the way it always had, except now there was something new in it, something warm and loud and kind and frightening. Humanity had arrived, and nothing was ever going to be the same.